When the god of thunder crashes into a dimension where gods are already dead, lightning becomes just another scream in the dark. The sky bleeds red, the ground feeds on war, and every demon learns to fight like him. In a realm where power teaches hell how to kill you better, even immortals run out of time. So what happens when the storm itself becomes the lesson? The sky split open like a wound across the face of creation. Not the clean surgical rupture of a portal gate calibrated by UAC technicians in sterile white rooms, but a jagged tear that screamed across 3 dimensions simultaneously, bleeding colors that had no name in any mortal tongue. The fault line carved itself through the Martian atmosphere above Kadingir Sanctum with the sound of grinding continental plates, and where it opened, reality itself began to fray. Oxygen ignited in cascading waves of blue-white fire. The magnetosphere buckled. Ancient stone monuments erected by the Night Sentinels 10,000 years ago cracked down their centers, dust pouring from fractures that had survived the fall of empires. Sentinel Kale stood on the broken rampart, overlooking the Argent Breach, his rifle clutched in hands that had forgotten stillness months ago, and watched the sky die. He had been born into war. His father had worn the silver armor before him, and his grandfather before that, stretching back through generations to when the Sentinels had been more than scavengers clinging to the bones of their civilization. But in all the scrolls preserved in the Tomb of Kings, in all the Jangur sung in the Hall of Ascension before it burned, Kale had never read of anything like this. The breach was not following Hell's geometry. The angles were wrong. The energies pouring through the wound carried harmonics that made his teeth ache and his skin prickle with static electricity. Lightning crawled across the rupture like veins of molten silver spreading through dead flesh. Below him, the battlefield stretched toward the horizon in every direction, a wasteland of scorched earth and broken machinery where the last fortress of humanity fought its infinite war. Titangent-class demons shambled through forests of twisted metal, each one tall enough to crush buildings beneath their hooves. Mancubi squadrons vomited gouts of chemical fire across the no-man's land between the defensive walls and the Hell Breach. The air tasted of copper and sulfur and burning oil. Artillery shells traced red arcs through the smoke, detonating against demonic flesh with impacts that shook the ground but never seemed to slow the advance. The demons were always advancing. Kale had learned to stop counting the fallen. There were too many, and the numbers meant nothing when Hell could birth replacements faster than you could kill them. The breach at the center of the battlefield pulsed like a second sun, crimson and gold, feeding corruption into the world with every beat. Argent energy fountained from its core in visible waves that warped the air and turned sand to glass. When the wind shifted, you could hear screaming from inside it. Not human screaming, something older. Then the sky split, and everything stopped. Even the demons turned their burning eyes upward as the lightning intensified, as something vast and terrible began to force its way through the dimensional tier. Kale felt his breath catch. For one impossible moment, the battlefield fell silent. 20,000 combatants on both sides, locked in eternal slaughter, paused to witness what came next. A figure emerged from the storm. He fell like a meteor, trailing fire and ozone, wreathed in electrical discharge so bright it left after-images burned across Kale's vision. The impact crater carved itself into the earth a quarter-mile from the fortress walls, throwing up a mushroom cloud of dust and vaporized stone that rose 300 feet into the scarlet sky. The shockwave knocked Kale from his feet. Alarms shrieked across the defensive network. Automated turrets swiveled toward the impact site, targeting lasers, painting the dust cloud crimson. For 5 heartbeats, nothing moved. Then lightning exploded outward from the crater in a perfect sphere, and Kale saw him clearly for the first time. The stranger stood at the center of devastation, planted on ground that still glowed cherry red from the heat of his arrival. He was tall, powerfully built, wearing armor that seemed to blend medieval craftsmanship with something else, something that caught and reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. A crimson cape hung from his shoulders, untouched by the flames licking across the crater's edge. In his right hand, he held a weapon, a hammer forged from metal that seemed to contain its own internal storm, electricity dancing across runes carved into its surface. His eyes blazed with power that made Argent energy look dim by comparison. Thor, son of Odin, prince of Asgard, surveyed the battlefield before him and felt his heart sink into darkness. This was not Svartalfheim, not the dark elf realm he had been traveling toward when the Bifrost had destabilized mid-transit, torn apart by forces he did not understand. The Rainbow Bridge had screamed and shattered around him, dumping him into the void between dimensions where the cold was absolute and the silence was complete. He had fallen for what felt like centuries, watching his lightning fade against the nothing, until reality had grabbed him again and hurled him here. To whatever hell this place was, the sky was wrong. It burned red and gold like the heart of a dying star, but there was no star visible through the haze. The air tasted of sulfur and old blood. The ground beneath his boots was scorched to blackness, cracked and bleeding vapor from deep fissures that glowed with internal heat. And everywhere he looked, he saw war. Fortresses of black metal and grey stone stretched across the landscape, bristling with weapons he did not recognize but understood instinctively were instruments of death. Humans in advanced armor manned the walls, firing projectiles that moved faster than arrows, struck harder than any siege engine. But they were losing. Thor could see it in the desperate spacing of their defensive positions, in the way they clustered around weak points in their perimeter, throwing everything they had at an enemy that simply would not stop coming. And the enemy. Thor had fought demons before. He had walked the burning fields of Muspelheim and put down the fire giants that crawled from their forges. He had descended into Nidavelia's darkest pits to seal breaches where elder things tried to claw their way into reality. But these creatures were something else entirely. They towered over the battlefield like walking mountains, their flesh a mixture of organic tissue and architectural corruption, as if reality itself had been convinced to betray its own rules and birth monsters that should not exist. A titan demon pulled itself from a glowing rupture in the earth, its body still forming, fresh meat wrapping around an internal architecture of bone and burning light. It stood 200 feet tall, its head brushing the smoke layer. When it roared, the sound was not just noise but a physical force that rippled across the landscape and shattered windows in the fortress walls. Thor felt Mjolnir grow warm in his grip, responding to his rising fury. These people were fighting alone against impossible odds. Their walls were crumbling. Their weapons, advanced as they were, could not stem the tide. He could see it in the trajectory of the battle, the way the defensive line was collapsing inward, compressing toward a final stand that would end in annihilation. How long had they been fighting? Weeks? Months? Years? The answer did not matter. Thor raised Mjolnir toward the burning sky and called the storm. Lightning answered. It fell from the clouds in jagged pillars that struck the ground with the force of artillery shells, each bolt precisely targeted, each one finding demonic flesh. The titan that had just emerged took a direct strike to its core, electricity pouring through its body in visible currents that lit up its internal structure like a grotesque lantern. It staggered, roaring in confusion and pain, smoke pouring from wounds that had appeared instantaneously across its hide. Thor was already moving. He launched himself from the crater with a single bound, Mjolnir pulling him through the air, in a trajectory that intersected with the Titan's center mass. He struck like a thunderbolt made flesh, the hammer's impact creating a compression wave that rippled outward through the demon's body. Bone shattered. Corrupted tissue exploded outward in sprays of black ichor that ignited in the presence of his lightning. The Titan tried to swat him away, but Thor was already gone, rebounding off its chest and falling toward a cluster of lesser demons below. He hit the ground running, and the killing began in earnest. A mancubus turned toward him, its twin flame cannons already tracking, but Thor covered the distance before it could fire. Mjolnir crushed through its skull with a wet crunch that sent fragments of bone and brain matter spraying across the scorched earth. He spun, catching a Hell Knight in mid-leap, the hammer striking it so hard its body liquefied from the impact, reduced to component atoms that scattered on the wind. 3 more demons charged from his left. He swept Mjolnir in a horizontal arc and called lightning down simultaneously, the combined assault creating a kill zone 20 feet wide where nothing survived. Electricity danced across the battlefield, seeking targets with predatory intelligence. From his position on the rampart, Cale watched with an expression caught somewhere between awe and terror. The stranger moved through the demon horde like a force of nature given human form. Every swing of his weapon created destruction that matched their heaviest artillery. Lightning fell at his command, not the random discharge of natural storms, but precisely targeted bolts that never missed, never struck the wrong target, never wasted power on empty ground. Demons that had withstood sustained autocannon fire evaporated under the stranger's assault. The Titan that had taken the first lightning strike tried to regroup, to regenerate the damage it had suffered, but Thor was not finished with it. He planted his feet and hurled Mjolnir with all his strength, the hammer spinning through the air with a sound like tearing metal, trailing electrical discharge that carved luminous spirals through the smoke. It struck the Titan's core dead center and detonated. The explosion was not fire or concussive force, but pure electrical discharge, a sphere of lightning that expanded outward at supersonic speeds, consuming the Titan from the inside out. Its roar became a scream, became silence. The massive body toppled, crashing to earth with an impact that registered on seismographs 300 miles away, and where it fell, nothing remained but a crater filled with smoking ash. Mjolnir returned to Thor's hand like a loyal hound. But even as the Titan fell, Thor felt something wrong beneath the victory. The demons were still coming. The breach in the earth, that glowing wound from which the Titan had emerged, pulsed brighter now, as if responding to the carnage. More shapes were forming in its depths, larger shapes, and the air itself had changed. The sulfur smell was intensifying, mixing with something else, something that made his skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. The breach was studying him. Thor could not explain how he knew this, but the certainty settled into his gut like a stone. The wound in reality was not just a passive portal. It was observing, learning, adapting to the new threat he represented. Every bolt of lightning he called down, every demon he destroyed, was being analyzed by something vast and ancient that lived on the other side of that threshold. He had faced many enemies in his long life, but he had never encountered something that could learn from being attacked. A voice crackled in his ear, transmitted through technology he did not possess but which had somehow locked onto him anyway. The voice was human, male, roughened by combat and exhaustion but still carrying authority. It spoke in a language Thor should not have understood, yet the meaning translated itself directly into his thoughts. Unknown combatant, identify yourself immediately or be classified as hostile. You have 30 seconds to respond. Thor glanced toward the fortress walls and saw weapons tracking him now. The automated defense systems no longer focused solely on demons. He understood their caution. He had appeared from nowhere, wielding power they could not measure, destroying their enemies with efficiency that might mark him as an even greater threat. In their position, he would do the same. He raised Mjolnir high, letting lightning play across its surface in patterns that spelled no threat in the universal language of power restrained, and spoke into the burning air. I am Thor Odinson of Asgard, and I stand with you against this darkness. The silence that followed his declaration stretched for 3 full seconds, an eternity in combat time. Then the voice returned, carrying a different tone now, something that might have been grim humor under better circumstances. Well, Prince of Asgard, or whoever the hell you really are, if you're serious about standing with us, we've got about 3,000 more targets incoming from Sector 7. Think you can handle that? Thor looked toward the indicated direction and saw the new wave emerging, not just demons, but something worse. The ground itself was splitting open in long parallel fissures, each one belching corruption into the world, and from every crack emerged creatures that made the previous assault look like a scouting party. Baron-class demons, each one capable of tearing through armored vehicles with their bare hands, archviles that could resurrect fallen demons faster than they could be killed. And behind them, something bigger was forming, a shadow that blotted out the red sky. Thor felt the weight of Mjolnir in his hand and thought of Asgard, of the golden halls and green fields, of his people who had trusted him to protect them. He thought of the Bifrost lying shattered somewhere in the void between dimensions, of how long it might take to repair, of whether he would ever see his home again. Then he looked at the humans manning those walls, at their desperate courage in the face of annihilation, and made his choice. "I can handle that," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. He charged forward to meet the new wave, lightning trailing from his body like a banner of war, and Kale watched him go with something like hope beginning to bloom in his chest for the first time in months. Perhaps they had been sent a champion. Perhaps the gods had not abandoned them after all. He did not yet understand that in this universe, the gods were already dead, and Thor had just volunteered to join them in damnation. The Prince of Asgard met the demon horde at the center of no man's land, where the earth was churned to black mud by endless combat, and the air itself had given up on supporting life. He did not slow, did not hesitate, simply launched himself into the mass of corrupted flesh, with Mjolnir leading the way. The first Baron took the hammer full in the chest and disintegrated, its essence scattered across 3 dimensions. Thor landed in the space it had occupied and spun, the hammer describing a perfect circle that carved a kill zone 15 feet in radius. Limbs separated from bodies, heads rolled like broken toys. Blood that burned like acid splashed across his armor and evaporated in the heat of his lightning. An archvile raised its skeletal hands to begin its resurrection ritual, green flame gathering in its palms. But Thor was faster. He hurled Mjolnir with pinpoint accuracy, the hammer pulverizing the demon's skull mid-cast, and the gathered energies discharged harmlessly into the ground. Thunder rolled across the battlefield, loud enough to drown out the artillery fire, announcing his presence to everything still standing. The demons adapted. They stopped charging blindly and began to coordinate, forming attack patterns that split his attention, forced him to defend from multiple angles simultaneously. Hell Knights flanked him, while Mancubi provided covering fire. Cacodemons descended from above, spitting plasma that forced him to dodge or be consumed. They were learning his rhythm, studying the patterns of his assault, finding gaps in his defense. But Thor had been fighting coordinated enemies for over 1,000 years. He called lightning down in a spiral pattern that caught the cacodemons mid-flight, their organic gas sacs rupturing in the electrical discharge, bodies tumbling from the sky like burning meteors. He swept Mjolnir low, catching the Hell Knights at knee level, breaking their legs and sending them sprawling. Before they could recover, he brought the hammer down on each skull in turn, executing them with brutal efficiency. The Mancubi fired in unison, twin streams of chemical flame converging on his position, and Thor simply leapt straight up, ascending 50 feet in a single bound, letting the flames wash beneath him. At the apex of his jump, he threw Mjolnir down through the center of their formation, and the resulting explosion carved a crater 20 feet deep. He landed on the crater's edge and surveyed the destruction. Dozens of demons lay broken around him, their bodies already beginning to dissolve into the toxic atmosphere that hell seemed to generate naturally. But hundreds more were still coming, pouring from the breaches in tireless waves, and beyond them, Thor could see the shadow he had spotted earlier resolving into something solid, a cyber demon. The creature pulled itself from the earth like a warrior god rising from its tomb, mechanical augmentation fused with demonic tissue in ways that violated every law of natural biology. Its left arm ended in a plasma cannon, the size of a cargo container. Its legs were hydraulic pistons wrapped in muscle tissue that steamed in the cool air. Its face was horned skull mounted on a torso that blazed with internal heat, and its eyes burned with intelligence that was far too focused, far too aware. It looked directly at Thor and fired. The plasma bolt moved faster than sound, crossing the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. Thor raised Mjolnir and caught the blast on the hammer's face, channeling the energy away from his body. But the force of impact drove him backward, his boots carving trenches through the dead earth. Heat washed over him in a wave that would have flash-fried unprotected flesh. Warning indicators flashed in his peripheral vision, his armor's enchantments struggling to dissipate the thermal load. The cyber demon fired again, 3 rapid shots that forced Thor into evasive maneuvers. He rolled right, planted Mjolnir, and launched himself skyward, ascending above the plasma stream. From 50 feet up, he could see the full scope of the battlefield, the way the demon forces were repositioning to support their champion, creating a perimeter that would trap him against the cyberdemon's overwhelming firepower. Thor made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He stopped ascending and let himself fall, building velocity, aiming for the cyberdemon's center mass. Mjolnir blazed with lightning, the electrical discharge growing so bright it cast shadows across the entire battlefield. He fell like divine judgment, like the wrath of storm gods given physical form, and when he struck, the world trembled. The impact created a shockwave that flattened everything within 100 yards. The cyberdemon staggered, its targeting systems disrupted, smoke pouring from damaged servos. Thor landed on its shoulder, already swinging, Mjolnir connecting with the mechanical arm joint in a strike that generated enough force to shear hardened steel. The plasma cannon tore free, tumbling to earth, trailing sparks and hydraulic fluid. The cyberdemon roared and tried to grab him, but Thor was already moving, running along its back, hammer rising and falling in methodical strikes that targeted every joint, every weak point, every place where flesh met metal. He knew how to kill giants. He had done it before, many times, and the principle was always the same. Find the structure that holds them upright, destroy it, and let gravity do the rest. Mjolnir smashed through spinal augmentation with impacts that rang like church bells. The cyberdemon toppled forward, crashing to earth with enough force to register as a minor earthquake. Thor rode it down and delivered the killing blow, Mjolnir crushing through its skull, pulverizing the brain case, ending its existence in a spray of ichor and machine oil. Silence fell across the battlefield like a curtain dropping. The remaining demons, those that had not been caught in the shockwave of the cyberdemon's fall, hesitated. It was a momentary pause, barely a second long, but Thor felt it clearly. For the first time since his arrival, the enemy was uncertain. They had thrown their best at him, and he had killed it. The tactical calculation was simple. They could overwhelm him through sheer numbers, but the cost would be catastrophic. Hell was many things, but it was not wasteful. The demons began to withdraw, pulling back toward the breaches in coordinated fashion that spoke of central control, of some vast intelligence directing their movements from beyond the veil. They did not flee in panic, but retreated in good order, maintaining formation, covering each other's withdrawal. Within minutes, the battlefield was clear except for the corpses, and even those were dissolving, pulled back into whatever realm had spawned them. Thor stood among the ruins of his victory and felt no triumph. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. He could see it in the way the breaches remained open, pulsing with steady rhythm like infected wounds in reality's flesh. He could feel it in the air, the way the corruption had not diminished despite the carnage. If anything, it had grown stronger, feeding on the violence, growing fat on death. This was not Ragnarok. This was something worse. The voice returned to his ear, the human commander from the fortress walls. "Unknown combatant, you've bought us breathing room. Command wants you to report to Gate 7 for debrief. Do not approach any other entrance. Automated defenses will engage if you deviate from the designated path. Acknowledge." Thor looked toward the fortress and saw the gate in question opening, a massive slab of reinforced steel sliding aside to reveal a passage lit by harsh white light. Figures in power armor stood just inside, weapons at ready but not quite aimed at him. An invitation and a warning delivered simultaneously. He started walking, Mjolnir resting easily on his shoulder, and wondered what he had gotten himself into. The fortress interior was a study in functional brutality, all bare metal walls and exposed conduits, everything designed for maximum efficiency with zero consideration for aesthetics. The corridors were wide enough to accommodate power loaders and weapons platforms, the ceilings high enough for troops in full combat gear to move at speed. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of red and amber. Somewhere deeper in the complex, alarms were still sounding, a steady drone that spoke of permanent crisis. Thor was escorted by 6 soldiers in advanced armor that incorporated technologies he did not recognize but understood were formidable. They kept their weapons lowered, but their stances ready, maintaining a loose perimeter around him as they moved through the facility. None of them spoke. Their faces were hidden behind helmets that reflected his image back at him, showing him what he looked like to them, a warrior from another age, covered in demon blood, carrying a weapon that sparked with residual electricity. They arrived at a command center carved deep into the fortress's heart. The room was dominated by a circular table covered in holographic displays that showed tactical overlays of the battlefield he had just left. Dozens of personnel worked at stations around the perimeter, coordinating defensive operations, routing resources to weak points, trying to hold a line that stretched across continents. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and human sweat. At the center of it all stood the commander. She was tall, lean, her face weathered by combat and stress into something that might have been beautiful once but was now simply hard. Her uniform bore insignia Thor did not recognize, but the authority in her bearing needed no translation. When she looked at him, her eyes were calculating, measuring him against threat models he could only guess at. "I am Commander Valen," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "Acting commander of Kadingir Sanctum and the Martian Defense Grid. Before we continue this conversation, I need to understand exactly what you are and how you got here. Speak plainly and quickly. We don't have time for riddles." Thor met her gaze steadily and chose his words with care. "I am Thor, son of Odin, prince of the realm called Asgard. I arrived here by accident when the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that connects the 9 realms, destabilized during transit. I do not know where I am, what world this is, or what enemy you face, but I recognize evil when I see it, and I offer my aid freely in its destruction." Commander Valen's expression did not change, but Thor saw her fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the tactical table. Around them, the command center had gone quiet, personnel abandoning their stations to listen. The weight of their attention pressed against him like physical force. Bifrost, Asgard, 9 realms. Valen repeated the terms slowly, as if tasting them for deception. "You're claiming to be a god." "I am not a god," Thor corrected. "I am a warrior of a people who were mistaken for gods by primitive cultures. We are long-lived, powerful, but not divine. We can be killed, though it is difficult, and I am telling you the truth." Valen studied him for a long moment, then gestured to one of her officers. A new holographic display materialized above the table, showing footage captured by orbital satellites and ground-based cameras. Thor watched himself fall from the sky, watched his assault on the demon horde, watched the cyber-demon fight rendered in perfect clarity from multiple angles. "Whatever you are," Valen said quietly, "you just killed more demons in 20 minutes than our entire garrison has managed in the last month. The energy readings we're getting from your weapon are off the scale. Nothing we've ever encountered produces that kind of output. Not Argent reactors, not experimental fusion cores, nothing." She leaned forward, and Thor saw something in her eyes that was more dangerous than suspicion. It was hope, desperate and fragile, the kind that could turn to fury if disappointed. "So, I'm going to ask you this once, and I need a straight answer. Can you help us win this war?" Thor looked past her at the holographic displays, showing the true scope of the conflict. The fortress was not the only defensive position. There were hundreds of them scattered across the planet's surface, all marked in red, all under siege. The demon breaches were everywhere, tearing through reality like cancer, and the defensive lines were collapsing slowly but inevitably toward a final extinction event. The humans had been fighting for years, he realized. Maybe longer. They had built incredible weapons, marshaled every resource their civilization possessed, and they were still losing, because hell was infinite, and they were not. "I do not know," Thor answered honestly. "I do not know what hell is in this realm, where it comes from, or what sustains it, but I will fight beside you until I find a way home, or until there is nothing left to fight. This I swear on my father's name and the honor of Asgard." The silence that followed was broken by a new alarm, this one different from the others, higher pitched, more urgent. A technician called out from across the room. "Commander, "We have massive energy spike from the Alpha breach. Something's coming through, something big." Valen's face hardened into a mask of professional calm, but Thor saw the fear flicker briefly in her eyes. Classification? Unknown. Bigger than the cyber demon. Energy signature is similar to a Titan but amplified. It's still forming. ETA to full manifestation, approximately 2 minutes. Valen turned back to Thor. "You want to help? Prove it. Come with me." She was already moving toward the exit, barking orders as she went, and Thor followed without hesitation. They ran through corridors that had suddenly become rivers of personnel rushing to battle stations. Blast doors slammed shut behind them as they ascended toward the surface. The alarm's pitch was climbing, building toward crescendo. They emerged onto the rampart where Kale still stood, the young sentinel's eyes wide with exhaustion and residual awe. Valen grabbed a pair of high-powered optics from a nearby weapons rack and pointed them toward the largest breach, the one the technicians had called Alpha. "See for yourself," she said, handing the optics to Thor. He raised them to his eyes and felt his blood run cold. The creature pulling itself through the breach was not a demon in any traditional sense. It was a moving architecture, a structure of flesh and bone and malevolent intelligence that violated perspective itself. It stood at least 500 feet tall, each step crushing the earth beneath it into glass, and it was still growing, pulling more of its mass through the dimensional wound with terrible patience. Its body was covered in eyes. Thousands of them, each one tracking independent targets across the battlefield. Its limbs ended not in hands but in clusters of smaller limbs, fractal repetitions of its own structure. And it was singing. Thor could hear it even at this distance, a sound that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly in his bones. It was not music but mathematics, reality itself being rewritten in real time through pure sonic manipulation. Where the sound touched, matter behaved incorrectly. Stone flowed like water. Metal bent without force applied. The laws of physics became suggestions. "We call it a Balgar," Valen said quietly. "Demon god construct. We've encountered 3 of them in the last year. It took combined orbital bombardment and a full nuclear strike to kill the last one, and we lost 40,000 people in the process. We don't have those resources here. We don't have anything that can stop it." She turned to Thor, and in her eyes he saw the question she was too proud to ask directly. "Can you?" Thor watched the Balgar continue its emergence, watched reality buckle under its presence, and felt Mjolnir grow warm in his hand, the hammer sensing the scale of the threat, responding to his rising determination. He thought of Asgard and the Bifrost lying shattered in the void. He thought of the rainbow bridge that connected worlds and how its energies had been strong enough to tear through dimensions when destabilized. He thought of what might happen if he channeled that same kind of power through Mjolnir against this abomination. "I do not know if I can kill it," Thor said, "but I know I must try." He stepped up onto the rampart's edge, wind whipping his cape behind him, and raised Mjolnir toward the burning sky. Lightning answered his call, but this time it was different. This time he did not merely summon the storm but reached beyond it, diving deep into the cosmic energies that powered the Bifrost itself, tapping into the fundamental forces that bound the 9 realms together. The hammer blazed white-hot in his grip. The sky screamed. What fell from the heavens was not lightning but raw dimensional energy given destructive form, a pillar of power that connected Earth to heaven in a column that illuminated the entire planet. It struck the Balgar dead center, and the resulting explosion was visible from orbit. The shockwave leveled everything within a mile radius. Fortress walls cracked, windows shattered, personnel were thrown from their feet, automated systems overloaded and failed. The air itself caught fire, oxygen igniting in a sphere that expanded outward at supersonic speeds. When Thor's vision cleared, he saw that the Balgar was still standing. Damaged, yes. One entire quadrant of its body had been vaporized, exposing internal structures that pulsed with sickly light. Several hundred of its eyes had burst, weeping fluid that steamed as it touched the ground, but it was still standing, still growing, still pulling more of itself through the breach, and now it was looking directly at him. The Balgar's song changed. shifting to a frequency that made Thor's teeth rattle in their sockets. Reality around the creature began to crystallize, air solidifying into geometric patterns that spread outward like infection. Where the patterns touched, things stopped obeying causality. Bullets fired at it traveled backward. Artillery shells aged 1,000 years in flight and crumbled to dust. Even light bent incorrectly around its form. Thor realized with mounting horror that the Balgar was adapting to him specifically, rewriting the rules of engagement to neutralize his power. Just as the Breach had studied him earlier, learning from his lightning, Valen's voice reached him through the chaos. "Get down from there. We need to evacuate the sector." But Thor did not move. He stood on that rampart with Mjolnir blazing in his hand and understood with sudden, terrible clarity what he was facing. This was not merely a war against demons. This was a war against a force that could learn, adapt, and evolve faster than any defense could be mounted. Every victory fed it new data. Every weapon used against it became obsolete the moment it survived the first application. The humans had not been losing because they were weak or cowardly. They had been losing because they were fighting an enemy that consumed opposition and grew stronger from it. An enemy that had been doing this for eons, across countless dimensions, perfecting its strategies against every form of resistance the multiverse could offer. And Thor, in his arrogance, had just taught it how to counter celestial energy. The Balgar finished its emergence and took its first full step onto Martian soil. The impact registered on seismic sensors across the southern hemisphere. Its song intensified, and Thor felt the dimensional fabric around him beginning to fray, reality itself losing cohesion under the sustained assault. If it reached the fortress, it would not need to fight. It would simply unmake the defensive position, dissolving it back into component atoms. Thor made his choice. He leapt from the rampart, not toward the Balgar but away from it, leading it away from the fortress, drawing its attention with a sustained barrage of lightning that he knew would not kill it, but would serve as an irresistible taunt. He ran across the battlefield at supernatural speed, Mjolnir pulling him forward in great bounding leaps that covered hundreds of yards per second. The Balgar followed. Each of its steps shook the world. Its song pursued Thor like a living thing, reality distorting in waves that tried to catch him, to pin him down, to subject him to whatever malevolent geometry it had prepared. But Thor had been running from impossible things since he was a child racing his brother through Asgard's golden halls, and he knew how to stay one step ahead of oblivion. He led it away from the fortress, away from the human defenders, toward the open wasteland where nothing lived, and nothing would mourn if the earth itself was destroyed. Behind him, he heard Valen shouting orders, heard the fortress lockdown procedures engaging, heard the desperate relief in her voice as she realized what he was doing. He was buying them time, perhaps enough time to evacuate, perhaps enough time to call for reinforcements from whatever central command structure coordinated this war, perhaps enough time to remember him as something other than the fool who made everything worse. Thor ran for 3 miles before he turned to face his pursuer, planting himself on a ridge of volcanic rock that overlooked a canyon carved by ancient rivers. The Balgar approached with terrible inevitability, its form blotting out the sky, its song building toward a crescendo that would shatter mountains. He raised Mjolnir and prepared to make his final stand, not because he believed he could win, but because he was Thor Odinson and he did not know how to do anything else. The hammer blazed with lightning that illuminated the wasteland like a second sun. The Balgar's 1,000 eyes fixed upon him with predatory focus. And somewhere far above, watching through sensors and satellites and dimensional viewing equipment, Commander Valen witnessed the beginning of a battle that would reshape her understanding of what was possible in this war. Because Thor was not merely fighting the Balgar. He was fighting the fundamental nature of hell itself, the infinite hunger that consumed all opposition. And in that moment of desperate courage, he became something more than a warrior from another realm. He became a symbol. Hope is a dangerous thing in a war without end, but it was also the one weapon hell could not fully adapt to, could not completely counter, because it existed not in weapons or tactics, but in the hearts of those who refused to surrender. Thor swung Mjolnir with all his strength, and the thunder that followed could be heard across half the planet. The battle had begun. The Balgar's first attack was not physical but conceptual, a restructuring of local causality that attempted to convince the universe Thor had never existed in the first place. Reality wavered around him like heat shimmer, his own body starting to fade at the edges, but Mjolnir's enchantments held firm, anchoring him to existence through sheer mystical inertia. The hammer had been forged in the heart of a dying star by dwarven smiths who understood the deep grammar of creation, and it would not let its wielder be unmade so easily. Thor felt the assault like pressure against his mind, a terrible force trying to edit him out of the present moment, but he pushed back with will that had been tempered across 1,000 years of combat. He existed, he was real, no demon construct would convince him otherwise. The fading stopped. Solidity returned. He launched himself at the Balgar, closing the distance between them in 3 massive bounds, Mjolnir leading the way. The hammer struck the demon's leg with enough force to crack continental plates, and this time, without the need to hold back for nearby friendlies, Thor channeled everything he had into the impact. Lightning exploded outward in a hemisphere that carved a crater 200 yards wide and 50 feet deep. The Balgar staggered, but it did not fall. Instead, it adapted. The flesh around the impact site hardened, crystallizing into something that looked like black diamond, spreading across its surface in geometric patterns. When Thor struck again, aiming for the same location, the hammer rebounded with a metallic clang that sent vibrations up his arms. The demon had turned its own body into armor, restructuring its biology in real time to counter kinetic force. Thor changed tactics immediately. If physical force would not suffice, he would try thermal energy. He called down a sustained lightning barrage that concentrated on a single point, heating the crystalline armor to temperatures that should have turned it molten. The air itself ignited around the impact site, creating a column of plasma that rose 300 feet into the burning sky. The Balgar's song shifted in response. The heat began to flow backward, absorbed into the demon's body through channels that materialized specifically to handle thermal load. It was not just defending itself, but incorporating the attack, learning from it, preparing counters that would make future applications useless. Thor watched in growing frustration as his most powerful assault was simply eaten by the thing's adaptive biology. He needed a new approach, something the Balgar could not adapt to because it violated the fundamental rules it was using. Thor planted Mjolnir and thought of the Bifrost, of how it worked not by forcing passage through space but by folding space itself, bringing distant points into contact without crossing the intervening distance. The Rainbow Bridge was transportation, yes, but it was also a weapon of terrifying potential, capable of focusing stellar energies across dimensional boundaries. He had never tried to replicate that function through Mjolnir alone, without the focusing mechanisms built into the bridge itself, but he was out of better options. Thor gripped the hammer with both hands and began to spin, building velocity, calling upon every reserve of power his Asgardian physiology possessed. He spun faster, becoming a blur, electricity discharging from his body in spiraling patterns. The ground beneath his feet liquefied from the energy bleed. The air screamed, and then he released. Mjolnir flew from his hands at a significant fraction of light speed, trailing a rainbow wake that tore through dimensional boundaries, carrying with it not just kinetic force but spatial distortion itself. When it struck the Balgar, it did not merely impact. It punched through the demon's body and dragged a piece of another dimension with it, creating a miniature breach that opened inside the creature's core. The Balgar screamed. It was the first sound it had made besides its reality-warping song, and it was a sound of genuine pain, of damage so fundamental that even its adaptive biology could not immediately compensate. The breach inside its body began to tear outward, expanding, trying to pull the demon back through into whatever realm it had come from. Chunks of flesh were ripped away, dissolving as they crossed the dimensional threshold. Mjolnir returned to Thor's hand, and he did not hesitate. He threw again, and again, each impact creating a new micro-breach inside the Balgar's structure, each one tearing away more of its mass. The demon tried to close the breaches, tried to adapt its biology to handle trans-dimensional stress, but Thor was faster, striking before the adaptation could complete. For the first time since the battle began, the Balgar was losing ground, but victory came with a terrible cost that Thor did not immediately recognize. Each breach he created was not just damaging the Balgar, it was thinning the barriers between dimensions, weakening the fundamental structure that kept Hell separated from reality. He was winning the battle by slowly dismantling the walls that protected this universe from total corruption. The implications would not become clear until later, after the victory, when it was too late to take back what he had done. The Balgar made a final desperate attempt to survive, gathering all its remaining power into its song, trying to rewrite reality on a scale that would simply erase the battlefield and everything on it. The air began to shimmer with mathematical formulae made visible, reality itself becoming transparent, showing the churning chaos underneath that all stable matter was built upon. Thor felt the universe starting to come apart around him and knew he was out of time. He had one last throw, one final attack that would either end this or kill him trying. He raised Mjolnir toward the sky and called upon powers he had sworn never to use except in the most dire circumstances. He called upon the Odin Force. It was his birthright, the cosmic power that flowed through the blood of Odin's line, the same force that allowed the Allfather to reshape worlds and topple empires. Thor had access to only a fraction of it, and every use aged him, burned away pieces of his life span in exchange for power that dwarfed even his normal godlike abilities. He had used it perhaps 5 times in his entire existence, and each time had left him weakened for months afterward. But looking at the Balgar, at the way reality was dissolving around its form, Thor knew there was no other choice. The Odin force flooded through him like liquid fire, like drinking from the heart of creation itself. His body blazed with power that transcended mere electricity, power that was fundamental to the cosmos, power that had existed before the first stars ignited. Mjolnir responded to the surge by transforming, its surface inscriptions glowing with light that had not been seen since the hammer was first forged. Thor brought it down. The resulting explosion was not visible to the naked eye because it occurred across multiple spectrums simultaneously, bleeding through dimensions, affecting reality on levels that human senses were not equipped to process. But its effects were impossible to miss. The Balgar simply ceased to exist, not destroyed so much as edited out of every timeline simultaneously, erased from the causal chain so thoroughly that even its component atoms were scattered across dimensional boundaries where they could never reform. The silence that followed was absolute. Thor stood in the center of a crater that glowed with residual energies, Mjolnir smoking in his grip, every muscle in his body screaming from the strain. He felt hollow, emptied, the Odin force having burned through him and taken pieces of his vitality with it when it departed. His vision swam, his hands shook, blood trickled from his nose, though he did not remember being struck. But the Balgar was gone. The battlefield was clear. He had won. The triumph lasted approximately 5 seconds before he noticed what else had changed. The breaches, those wounds in reality that had been pulsing steadily throughout the battle, had gone quiet. Not closed, but dormant, as if whatever force sustained them had withdrawn to consider new information. The air itself felt different, charged with potential energy, like the pause before a lightning strike. Thor realized with dawning horror that Hell had just learned something very valuable from his victory. It had learned what Odin Force looked like, how it tasted, what wavelengths it operated on. It had studied the very power that had destroyed the Balgar, and now it was adapting, preparing counters, readying its next assault with full knowledge of what it would face. He had taught it how to fight gods. The sound of engines pulled his attention skyward. Aircraft were approaching from the fortress, human technology moving at speeds that would have impressed even Asgardian engineers. They circled his position, obviously assessing the damage, trying to determine if he was threat or ally. After a moment, one of them broke formation and descended, landing 50 yards from where he stood. Commander Valen emerged from the craft, flanked by armed soldiers, but she waved them back and approached Thor alone. Her face was unreadable as she surveyed the destruction. The empty space where the Balgar had stood, the lingering energies that still distorted the air. "You killed it," she said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with carefully controlled emotion. "I destroyed it," Thor corrected, "but I may have made a terrible mistake in doing so." He explained what he had realized, how his use of the Odin Force had given Hel new data to adapt to, how the next assault would be prepared for exactly the kind of power he had just displayed. Valen listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each word. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You're telling me that every weapon we develop, every tactic we use, makes Hel stronger in the long run?" "Yes." "Then we've been fighting this war wrong from the start. Every victory has just been teaching it how to beat us better next time." "Yes." Valen looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a terrible, exhausted understanding. "Welcome to the eternal war, Prince of Asgard. You just learned in one battle what it's taken us decades to accept. We're not fighting an enemy. We're fighting entropy itself, and entropy always wins in the end." She turned back toward her aircraft, then paused. "But we keep fighting anyway, because what else is there? Come on. Command will want to debrief you properly, and you look like you're about to fall over. We'll get you somewhere to recover, and then we'll figure out what to do with you." Thor followed her to the aircraft, every step an effort, his body still recovering from the Odin Force drain. As they lifted off, he looked back at the crater he had created and saw demons beginning to emerge from the dormant breaches, cautiously at first, testing to see if it was safe to return. They were already coming back, and they would never stop coming back, because that was their nature. He thought of Asgard and wondered if he would ever see it again. Then he thought of the humans fighting this impossible war and wondered if they would see tomorrow. The aircraft carried him back toward the fortress, and Thor closed his eyes against the exhaustion, trying to conserve what little strength remained. He needed to rest, to recover, to prepare for whatever came next. Because something would come next. In this war, there was always something next, and it was always worse than what came before. Behind them, the Martian wasteland stretched toward horizons painted in shades of rust and blood, and the breaches pulsed with renewed vigor as if Hel itself was excited about the new data it had collected. The war continued, as it always had, as it always would, and Thor had just become one more piece on an infinite chessboard where victory was impossible and defeat was merely delayed. But he was still breathing, still fighting, and as long as that remained true, he would not surrender. Because that was what heroes did, even when the heroism was pointless, even when the stories would never be told, even when the only reward for courage was the chance to be courageous again tomorrow. Thor Odinson rested his head against the cold metal of the aircraft's interior and let the darkness take him, knowing that when he woke, the war would still be waiting. It always was. The fortress interior was different from what Thor had seen during his initial escort to the command center. Valen led him through sections that were clearly residential, though the term was generous. The quarters were cramped, functional, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Soldiers moved through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of people who had been living on the edge of annihilation so long they no longer remembered what peace looked like. They passed a commissary where off-duty personnel ate in near silence, too exhausted for conversation. They passed a medical bay where doctors worked on injuries that made Thor's stomach tighten, burns from plasma weapons, corrupted tissue that had to be cut away before it spread, psychological trauma that had no visible wound but was somehow worse than the physical damage. Every person they passed stared at him with expressions that ranged from awe to suspicion to naked hope that made his chest ache with responsibility he had not asked for. Valen stopped at a door marked with designation codes Thor could not read and pressed her palm against a scanner. The lock disengaged with a heavy thunk. This was Commander Pierce's quarters before the Alpha breach took his entire unit. It's yours now if you want it. Food synthesizer in the wall, shower stall that actually has hot water most of the time, and a bed that doesn't fold up into the ceiling. Luxury accommodations by current standards. She turned to face him, and Thor saw past the professional mask to the exhaustion underneath. The deep weariness of someone who had been carrying impossible weight for far too long. Get some sleep, Prince. We'll talk strategy in 12 hours. I'm pulling together everyone who knows anything about dimensional mechanics. xenobiology, and esoteric threat assessment. If what you're saying is true about hell learning from us, we need to completely rethink our approach to this war. Thor nodded, too tired to argue, and watched her leave. The door slid shut behind her, and he was alone for the first time since falling into this nightmare realm. He looked around the sparse quarters and felt something inside him that might have been relief or might have been despair. He could no longer tell the difference. He stripped off his armor, piece by piece, discovering damage he had not noticed in the heat of battle. Scorch marks across the chestplate, dents in the pauldrons. His cape was tattered at the edges, threads burned away by proximity to energies that should have killed him outright. Mjolnir he set carefully on a table where he could reach it immediately if needed, the hammer still radiating faint warmth from their exertions. The shower was as promised, hot water that ran rust-colored for the first few seconds before clearing. Thor stood under the stream and watched demon blood wash down the drain, black ichor mixing with his own blood from wounds he had not felt being inflicted. The water stung in cuts he had not known existed. He stayed there until it ran cold, trying to wash away not just the physical evidence of battle but the existential horror of what he had learned. Every victory made hell stronger. Every weapon was eventually countered. The humans had been fighting a war they could not win for years, watching their defensive lines compress slowly toward extinction, and they kept fighting anyway because the alternative was to lie down and die. Thor thought of Asgard's warriors, of the glory they sought in battle, of the songs that would be sung about their deeds in the mead halls. There would be no songs here, only silence and ash and forgotten names scratched into memorial walls that would eventually be overrun by the very enemy they commemorated. What kind of courage did it take to fight without hope of victory? To know that your death would be meaningless in the grand scope of eternal war and still stand your ground? Thor had thought himself brave, had faced down frost giants and dark elves and armies that threatened the Nine Realms, but he had always believed victory was possible. Remove that belief, and what remained? He found the answer in the faces of the soldiers he had passed in the corridors. What remained was duty without glory, sacrifice without recognition, the simple, terrible courage to do what needed doing because it was right, not because it would succeed. Thor had never felt more humbled in his entire existence. He dried himself with a rough towel, put on the simple fatigues he found folded on the bed. They were too small but serviceable, and lay down expecting to be too wired to sleep. Instead, he was unconscious within seconds, his body simply shutting down to facilitate the recovery his Asgardian physiology was already attempting. He dreamed of home, of Asgard's golden spires catching sunlight that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, of his mother's garden where she grew flowers that sang when the wind touched them, of his father's throne room and the weight of expectation that came with being Odin's son, of his brother Loki, God's, his brother, with his sharp tongue and sharper mind, always 3 steps ahead in games Thor did not even know they were playing. The dream shifted, became darker, Asgard burning, the Bifrost shattered, his people scattered across the cosmos like dandelion seeds on a storm wind, and himself, alone, falling through the void between dimensions, calling for help that never came. He woke to the sound of alarms, not the general quarters alarm from before, but something else, a specific pattern that made the walls vibrate with urgency. Thor was on his feet before full consciousness returned, Mjolnir in his hand, armor materializing around him through enchantments woven into the metal itself, ancient magic that required no conscious thought. He burst into the corridor and found it empty, the soldiers having already rushed to whatever emergency had triggered the alarm. He followed the flow of traffic, letting the crowd carry him toward the command center, arriving to find organized chaos in full swing. Valen stood at the tactical display, her face illuminated by red warning indicators that painted her skin the color of fresh blood. She saw Thor enter and gestured him forward without preamble. "We've got a situation developing on 3 fronts simultaneously. This is wrong. Hell doesn't attack in coordinated waves like this. They probe, they push, but never full-scale assault on multiple fortresses at once. Something's changed." She expanded the tactical map, and Thor saw what she meant. 3 fortresses, spread across hundreds of miles, were all reporting massive demon incursions within minutes of each other. The attacks were too synchronized to be coincidence, too precise to be random aggression. "They're testing something," Thor said, understanding crystallizing in his mind. After the Balgar, Hell pulled back to analyze the data, and now it's implementing what it learned. "Those attacks are experiments to see how your defenses handle concentrated assault." "Wonderful," Valen muttered. "So we're laboratory rats now. How long do we have before they stop experimenting and start exterminating?" Before Thor could answer, the tactical display erupted with new warnings. Every single breach across the entire Martian surface had activated simultaneously, pouring demons into reality in numbers that made previous incursions look like reconnaissance patrols. The map turned red from pole to pole. Every fortress reported contact. Every defensive line was engaged. And then the sky above Kadingir's sanctum split open with familiar rainbow light. Thor's heart stopped. That was Bifrost energy. He was certain of it. But the signature was wrong, corrupted, like someone had taken the pure mathematics of Asgardian dimensional transit and twisted it into something malignant. The tear widened, and through it came not Asgardian warriors or rescue party, but demons carrying a distinctly different character from those they had fought before. These were larger, better armored, moving with coordination that spoke of trained discipline rather than simple hunger. They wore mockeries of battle gear, symbols etched into their hide that might have been unit designations or might have been something worse. And they fell upon the fortress walls with tactical precision that was terrifying to witness. "They're adapting their strategy," Valen breathed. "Copying our military structure. Oh gods, they're learning how to fight like us." Thor watched a demon squad execute a textbook flanking maneuver that would have impressed Asgard's Einherjar, and felt ice crystallize in his veins. Hell had not just learned to counter his power, it had learned the entire concept of organized warfare from watching human defenders, and now it was turning that knowledge against them. Every victory had made the enemy stronger. Every defensive stand had been a training exercise for Hell's endless armies. The humans had been teaching their own executioners how to kill them more efficiently. "What do we do?" one of the junior officers asked, voice cracking with barely controlled panic. Valen looked at Thor, and in her eyes he saw the question she could not voice aloud in front of her subordinates. "Do we run? Do we die here? Do we keep fighting this unwinnable war?" Thor gripped Mjolnir and felt its reassuring weight, the solid reality of a weapon forged by dwarf smiths who understood that some things endured precisely because they refused to break. He thought of Asgard and the values his father had tried to instill in him, not just courage in victory but grace in defeat, not just strength but wisdom to know when strength was not enough. "We adapt," Thor said. "If Hell learns from us, we learn from it. If it copies our tactics, we invent new ones. If it grows stronger from conflict, we change the nature of the conflict itself." "Pretty words," Valen said. "But how exactly do we implement them when we're about to be overrun?" Thor looked at the tactical display, at the coordinated assault converging on their position, and remembered something his brother Loki had once said during a rare moment of genuine advice rather than mischief. "The key to defeating an opponent who adapts is to make them adapt to the wrong thing." "They learned organized warfare by watching your defense," Thor said slowly, idea forming as he spoke. "They expect you to hold the walls, to fight from fortified positions, to play to your strengths. So we do the opposite. We abandon the fortress." The command center went dead silent. Valen stared at him as if he had suggested they all drink poison. "Abandon Kadingir. This fortress has held for 3 years. It's the primary defensive anchor for the entire southern hemisphere. If we lose it, the continental line collapses." "You're going to lose it anyway, if you fight here," Thor countered. "Those demons are executing coordinated assault specifically designed to breach fortified positions. They've studied your tactics. They know your defensive patterns. Every minute you spend fighting from the walls is feeding them more data about how to crack fortress defenses." He gestured at the map, highlighting terrain features surrounding the fortress. "But if you evacuate and lead them into open terrain, into environments where their numbers become a liability rather than an advantage, where their coordination is disrupted by geography. You force them to fight on your terms instead of terms they've prepared for. One of the tactical officers, a scarred woman whose nameplate read Kowalski, leaned forward. He's talking about fighting retreat through the Olympus Canyon network. It's a natural choke point, limits their numbers advantage, and the thermal vents make air support almost impossible. Forces close-range engagement where our power armor gives us an edge. It also means abandoning billions of credits worth of equipment and defensive infrastructure. Another officer objected. The UAC board will have our heads. Valen's laugh was bitter and sharp. The UAC board can take it up with Satan himself for all I care. If we're dead, their investment is worthless anyway. She studied the map for 3 seconds, making calculations that would determine thousands of lives, then slapped her palm down on the tactical table. Do it. Full evacuation protocols. Everything we can carry, priority to ammunition and power cells. Rig the fortress to blow on our way out. If hell wants Kadingir, they can have the rubble. Orders flew. The command center transformed into controlled chaos as personnel began executing evacuation procedures that had clearly been drilled but never expected to be used. Thor watched them work with professional efficiency, each person knowing their role, executing without hesitation despite the terror that must be gnawing at their guts. Valen pulled Thor aside as her subordinates coordinated the retreat. "This plan of yours better work, Prince. I'm gambling everything on the word of a man who fell out of the sky yesterday. If we lose the canyon, there's nowhere left to fall back to. The southern defensive line ends here." "I know," Thor said quietly. "And I will stand with your people every step of the way. If this fails, I will be the last one fighting, buying time for whoever survives to reach safety. This I swear." Valen studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you. Now come on, we need to move. Estimated time before those demons breach the walls is 18 minutes, and I want to be long gone before that happens." They ran. The evacuation was a marvel of logistics executed under impossible pressure. Soldiers moved in practiced patterns, grabbing pre-packed equipment caches, helping wounded personnel who could not move unassisted, destroying sensitive technology that could not be carried. The fortress that had seemed so solid, so permanent, was revealed to be just another temporary position in a war where nothing lasted forever. Thor helped where he could, using his strength to carry loads that would have required entire teams, clearing debris from collapsed passages, providing cover as the last defensive units pulled back from the walls. Outside, the demon assault intensified, the creatures sensing weakness, pressing harder against defenses that were deliberately collapsing. The last group was preparing to evacuate when Kale appeared. The young sentinel Thor had first seen on the rampart. He was carrying an ornate box that seemed far too precious for the circumstances, handling it with reverence that bordered on religious devotion. "The Codex fragment," Kale explained when he saw Thor's questioning look. "Records from before the fall of the Sentinel City, the last physical history of my people. I will not leave it for hell to defile." Thor understood. Some things were worth dying for, even in retreat. He nodded and moved to take point as they navigated through the fortress's lower levels toward the evacuation tunnels that would carry them to the canyon system. Behind them, the fortress walls finally gave way. The sound of their collapse echoed through the stone corridors like the death of gods. Demon roars followed, celebrating victory over a position they did not yet understand had been voluntarily abandoned. Thor allowed himself a grim smile. Let them celebrate. Let them occupy the empty fortress and think they had won. The real battle was about to begin, on ground of humanity's choosing, and this time hell's advantages would mean nothing. They emerged from the tunnels into Olympus Canyon just as the sun, such as it was through Mars' corrupted atmosphere, reached its zenith. The canyon walls stretched 300 feet high on either side, volcanic rock carved by ancient rivers into a natural fortification that twisted through the landscape for 50 miles. Thermal vents dotted the canyon floor, belching superheated steam that created visibility barriers and made aerial surveillance nearly impossible. It was perfect. Valen's forces spread through the canyon in a defensive formation that turned every bend, every outcropping, every shadow into a potential kill zone. Heavy weapons were positioned on the canyon rim, angled to provide crossfire that would turn the floor into a death trap. Mines were seeded at strategic choke points. Automated turrets were nestled into crevices where they had clear firing lanes but were protected from direct assault. And Thor stood at the canyon mouth, Mjolnir resting on his shoulder, waiting for Hel to arrive. He did not have to wait long. The demon vanguard appeared within minutes, moving with that disturbing coordination they had learned, spread in skirmish formation that maximized coverage while minimizing exposure to concentrated fire. They entered the canyon cautiously, scanning for threats, and Thor let them come. Let them commit. Let them believe they were pursuing a defeated enemy into a trap of their own making. When the vanguard was 50 yards into the canyon, Valen gave the signal. The world erupted in thunder and fury. Every weapon fired simultaneously, a coordinated barrage that turned the canyon floor into hell itself. Ironic given the enemy. Plasma bolts, ballistic rounds, energy beams, all converging on the tightly packed demon formation with devastating effect. The vanguard was shredded in seconds, their advanced tactics meaning nothing when confined to a killing ground where there was nowhere to dodge. But Hell was learning entity, and it adapted quickly. The second wave did not charge blindly into the canyon. Instead, demons began scaling the walls, using claws and corrupted biology to cling to sheer stone, attempting to flank the human positions from above. It was a reasonable tactical response that would have worked against static defenders. But Thor was not static. He leapt straight up, ascending the canyon wall in a single bound, and met the climbing demons halfway. Mjolnir carved through them like wheat before a scythe, each impact sending bodies tumbling to the canyon floor below. Lightning danced between targets, jumping from demon to demon, exploiting their proximity on the narrow wall to maximize casualties. He landed on the canyon rim and continued the slaughter, clearing a 100-yard stretch in less than a minute. Below, Valen's forces adjusted their positions, responding to the flanking attempt with practiced efficiency. Soldiers who had been defending the floor redeployed to the rim, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. The demons tried again, this time splitting their forces, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. It was sophisticated tactics that would have overwhelmed a static defense, but Valen had anticipated this. Her forces were mobile, flowing like water between positions, never staying in one place long enough to be pinned down, using the canyon's geography to force the demons to fight on human terms. Thor moved through the battle like a god of war, which is what he was, appearing wherever the fighting was thickest, turning the tide with applications of controlled violence that left no room for demonic adaptation. He was careful now, varying his tactics, never using the same approach twice, denying Hell the data it needed to counter him effectively. The battle raged for 6 hours. 6 hours of continuous combat where neither side gave quarter and the only rest was death. The canyon floor became a charnel house, piled so high with demon corpses that new arrivals had to climb over their fallen kin to reach the human lines. The air became thick with smoke and the stench of burning flesh. Ammunition stores dwindled. Soldiers fought with diminishing effectiveness as exhaustion set in, but they held. More importantly, they inflicted casualties at a ratio that would have been impossible in open battle. Every demon killed in the canyon was one fewer threatening the broader defensive network. Every minute Hell spent trying to crack this position was a minute other fortresses were catching their breath, regrouping, preparing for the next wave. And through it all, Thor fought with dedication that bordered on divine obsession. He had made a promise to stand with these people, and he would honor that promise even if it killed him. His arms ached from endless swinging. His muscles screamed from continuous exertion. The Odin Force depletion had not fully healed, leaving him operating at perhaps 70% of his normal capacity. But 70% of Thor was still more than most demons could handle. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon in shades of amber and blood, the demon assault finally broke. Not in panicked rout, but in organized withdrawal, the survivors pulling back in good order, carrying their wounded when possible, exactly like professional soldiers after a failed assault. Hell had learned restraint. That was somehow more terrifying than mindless fury. Valen appeared at Thor's side, her armor scorched and dented, blood on her face from a wound that had already been sealed with medical foam. "We held," she said, voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been disbelief. "Casualty rate is 40%, but we held. They're retreating." "For now," Thor said, watching the last demons disappear into the Martian wasteland. "They will return. But today was a victory, and victories matter, even small ones." Valen laughed, the sound breaking into something that was half sob. "Small victory. We just successfully evacuated a fortress, fought a running battle through hostile terrain, and held off a demon army in a canyon ambush. And you call that small, compared to the scope of this war?" "Yes." Thor turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes the weight of understanding he had gained. But small victories accumulate. They sustain morale. They prove that hell can be hurt, that its adaptation has limits, that courage and creativity can overcome raw power. Today you taught your soldiers that they are not helpless. That is worth more than any fortress. Valen was quiet for a long moment, processing his words, then nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right, Prince of Asgard, maybe. But right now, I'm too damn tired to philosophize. We need to secure this position, tend our wounded, and prepare for when they come back." She started to walk away, then paused. "Thank you. For staying. For fighting. For reminding us that we're not alone in this war. It matters more than you know." Thor watched her go, then looked down at Mjolnir in his hands, at the runes carved into its surface that had been there since the hammer's forging, symbols of honor and duty and protection. He had wielded this weapon across 9 realms in service of Asgard's glory, but he had never felt its weight quite like this, never understood the true burden of being a defender. These humans, these fragile mortals with their short lives and breakable bodies, they fought every day against an enemy that would never stop, never rest, never show mercy. And they fought not for glory or songs or divine reward, but simply because someone had to stand against the darkness. Thor had thought himself a hero for 1,000 years. Now he wondered if he had ever truly understood what heroism meant. Night fell over Olympus Canyon, and the soldiers made camp in defensive positions that could become graves with a moment's notice. They ate field rations that tasted like cardboard and drank recycled water that smelled faintly of chemicals. They cleaned weapons and tended wounds and stared into the darkness beyond their perimeter with eyes that had forgotten how to close peacefully. Thor moved among them, offering what comfort he could, helping with tasks that required strength beyond human capacity, and listening to their stories. Kael found him near a thermal vent, the young sentinel still clutching his precious codex fragment. "May I speak freely, Prince Thor?" "Always," Thor said. "And please, just Thor. I have left the pretension of titles on the other side of broken rainbows." Kael sat beside him, setting the codex box carefully on the ground between them. "Before you came, we thought ourselves abandoned by all higher powers. The Makers had proven false, hell had consumed our worlds, and the Slayer is myth and madness, a story we tell ourselves to make the horror bearable." He opened the codex box, revealing ancient pages covered in script that predated human civilization. But these texts speak of a time when the Sentinels stood with gods against the darkness, when celestial warriors walked among us and together we held back the tide. I had thought those stories mere fantasy, but then you fell from the sky wreathed in lightning. And I wonder what? Thor asked gently. If perhaps the universe has not abandoned us after all. If perhaps there are still powers that care whether we live or die. If perhaps your arrival is the first sign that the tide might finally turn. Thor felt the weight of that hope pressing against him like physical force. He wanted to tell Kael the truth, that his arrival was accident, not destiny, that he was as lost as any of them, that he had no grand plan or divine mandate. But looking at the young sentinel's face, at the desperate need for meaning that lived there, Thor could not bring himself to destroy that fragile hope. "I am no god," Thor said carefully, "and I cannot promise victory. but I can promise that as long as I draw breath, I will fight beside you. Whatever comes through those breaches, whatever horrors hell sends against us, you will not face them alone. This I swear on the honor of Asgard and the memory of my father." Kale's eyes grew wet, though whether from relief or exhaustion Thor could not tell. "That is enough," the sentinel said. "That is more than enough." They sat together in companionable silence, two warriors from different worlds united by common cause, and watched the stars emerge through Mars's corrupted atmosphere. The stars were wrong here, constellations Thor did not recognize, the sky of an alien universe that operated by rules he was only beginning to understand. Somewhere in that vast darkness, the Bifrost fragments drifted between dimensions, and Asgard stood without its prince. Somewhere, his father sat on his throne and wondered if his son still lived. Somewhere, his brother plotted schemes that would make sense only in retrospect, if they made sense at all. Thor missed them with an ache that had no name, but he could not abandon the people who needed him here and now in pursuit of home that might no longer exist. He was Thor, son of Odin, and he had made a promise. The night deepened. Guards changed. Wounded soldiers called out in pain-filled sleep. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the canyon's protection, Hell prepared its next move. Learning from failure, adapting to resistance, growing stronger with every passing moment. The war continued, as it always had, as it always would, and Thor had bound himself to its outcome. For better or worse, he was part of this story now, and he would see it through to whatever end awaited them all. Morning came with fire, not the gentle dawn Thor remembered from Asgard, where light spread slowly across the golden spires like honey pouring from a sacred vessel, but sudden and violent, the sky tearing open with ruptures that belched corruption into reality like blood from arterial wounds. The alarms shrieked across the canyon defensive network, and soldiers who had barely slept were on their feet before consciousness fully returned, moving on training and adrenaline and the terrible knowledge that rest was a luxury measured in hours, never days. Thor stood on the canyon rim watching the new assault form in the wasteland beyond, and what he saw made his blood run cold despite the Martian heat. The demons were not charging blindly as before. They were building. Structures were rising from the churned earth. Massive installations that resembled siege equipment but operated on principles Thor could not immediately identify. Dark metal frames twisted into geometries that hurt to look at directly, and within their cores, energies gathered that tasted of argent corruption mixed with something else, something that resonated with the same frequencies as the Bifrost. They were building dimensional artillery. Hell had studied the corrupted Rainbow Bridge energies from the previous breach, analyzed how Thor's arrival had warped local space-time, and now it was weaponizing those principles. The implications were staggering. If Hell could harness dimensional transit as an offensive tool, it could bypass defensive lines entirely, dropping assault forces directly into the heart of protected zones. Every fortress in the solar system would become indefensible. Valen appeared beside him, following his gaze to the construction taking shape in the distance. "What are we looking at?" "The end of fortress warfare as you know it," Thor said grimly. "Those devices will allow Hell to punch through dimensional barriers directly, bypassing your walls, your defensive perimeters, everything you've built to slow their advance. How long until they're operational?" Thor studied the energy patterns gathering in the siege equipment's core, comparing them to his instinctive understanding of Bifrost mechanics. "Hours, perhaps less. They are working faster than should be possible, as if guided by intelligence that already knows the solutions to problems they have not yet encountered." Valen cursed with impressive creativity. "They learned dimensional transit from your arrival. Every time we expose new technology, new tactics, we're just training them to kill us better." She slammed her fist against the canyon wall hard enough to draw blood. "How do we fight an enemy that learns from being attacked?" Thor was about to answer when motion in the canyon below caught his attention. Soldiers were gathering around a makeshift communications array, faces painted with expressions he had learned to dread, the look of people receiving news they desperately did not want to believe. Valen saw it too, and was moving before Thor could speak. Descending into the canyon with practiced efficiency, Thor following half a step behind. They reached the communications station to find the operator, a young woman whose name tag read Chen, staring at her display screen with the fixed intensity of someone confronting existential horror. She looked up as Valen approached and saluted with mechanical precision that could not quite hide her shaking hands. "Commander, we're receiving emergency transmissions from outposts across the southern grid. Multiple locations reporting dimensional breaches opening inside their defensive perimeters. Demons appearing directly in the command centers, armories, medical facilities." Her voice cracked. "They're not attacking the fortresses anymore. They're materializing inside them." Valen grabbed the display and scrolled through the incoming reports, each one more catastrophic than the last. Fortress names Thor had heard in strategic briefings marked with red indicators that meant overrun, compromised, gone. The southern defensive network was not collapsing. It was being systematically vivisected from within, each position falling in minutes rather than the hours or days previous sieges had required. "How?" Valen demanded. "Those dimensional artillery pieces haven't finished construction. How are they already deploying troops internally?" Thor understood before Chen could answer. "The artillery is not for deployment, it is for calibration. Hell is using those siege weapons to fine-tune its dimensional breach mechanics, learning the precise frequencies required to punch through reality at specific coordinates. Once they have the correct formula, they can open breaches anywhere, and the formula they are developing right now will work throughout your entire defensive network. They're field testing on our other fortresses," Valen said, voice hollow with the realization, "using them as experimental subjects to perfect the technique before deploying it here." "Yes." The silence that followed was broken by a new voice, this one coming from the communications array's priority channel, a frequency reserved for the absolute highest command authority. The voice was male, aged but still carrying steel beneath the exhaustion, and it spoke with the weight of someone delivering a verdict rather than an order. "All stations, this is Central Command. Authentication code Omega Black 7, effective immediately. All remaining fortress positions are ordered to implement Protocol Exodus. Repeat, Protocol Exodus is now active. May God have mercy on us all." The channel went dead. Thor watched the color drain from every face in the communications center. Soldiers exchanged glances that spoke of understanding he did not share. Valen stood frozen, staring at the now silent array as if it had pronounced her execution, which perhaps it had. "What is Protocol Exodus?" Thor asked quietly. Valen turned to him, and he saw in her eyes something he had never seen before. Not fear, not exhaustion, but the awful calm of someone who had finally accepted the inevitable. Total evacuation. Earth and her colonies. Every military asset, every civilian transport, every resource we can mobilize goes toward getting humanity off these worlds and into deep space. We're abandoning the solar system. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "Abandoned," Thor repeated, testing the weight of it. "You are leaving Earth? Your homeworld?" "There is no Earth anymore," Valen said, voice cracking for the first time since he had met her. "Not the way you mean it. The planet is there, yes, but it's Hell's planet now. Has been for years. We've been fighting a delaying action, trying to give civilians time to evacuate, trying to preserve something of human civilization to carry forward into whatever future awaits us. But if Hell can breach dimensional barriers at will, if they can appear inside our ships, our shelters, our final refuges, then there is nowhere left to run." She looked around at her soldiers, at the men and women who had followed her into the canyon and fought beside her through impossible odds. "Protocol Exodus means we're admitting defeat. It means we pack as many people as we can into whatever vessels remain intact and run like hell toward the outer colonies while praying hell doesn't follow. It means everything we've fought for, everyone we've lost, was for nothing." "No," Thor said, and the force in his voice cut through the despair like Mjolnir through demon flesh. "It means you fought long enough to give your people a chance at survival. It means you did not surrender when any rational assessment said you should. It means you gave your best in a war that was already lost before you picked up your weapons. and that takes courage beyond anything I have witnessed in 1,000 years of battle. He stepped forward so all could hear him clearly. I have fought alongside gods and heroes. I have stood in shield walls with the Einherjar and sailed with warriors whose names echo through eternity. But I have never witnessed valor like what you people display every waking moment. You fight without hope of victory, without promise of reward, without even the consolation that your sacrifice will be remembered, and you fight anyway because someone must. He raised Mjolnir, and lightning danced across its surface, casting everyone present in stark illumination. I swore to stand with you, and I keep my oaths. If you evacuate, I will buy you time. If hell pursues, I will slow them. If they breach your ships, I will seal the wounds. You will not face annihilation alone. The silence that followed was different than before. Not the silence of despair, but of fragile hope taking root in scorched earth. Valen straightened, and Thor watched her transform back into the commander who had led her people through years of impossible war. Then we need to move fast. Exodus Protocol gives us 12 hours to get as many soldiers off this rock as possible before the fleet jumps. That means fighting retreat to the primary spaceport while Hell is distracted perfecting their dimensional weapons. She turned to her officers. Kowalski, coordinate with remaining units across the grid. Anyone who can move, we're collecting them for the evacuation. Chen, get me updated positions on all transport capacities still intact. If it has engines and life support, I want it on the evacuation manifest. Orders flew. The command center transformed once again into controlled chaos as personnel began executing procedures that represented the end of humanity's presence in the inner solar system. Thor watched them work and felt profound admiration for their professionalism even in the face of species-level retreat. But he also felt the stirrings of a plan, dangerous and probably futile, but the only option he could see that might give these people more than a running chance at survival. He pulled Valen aside while her subordinates coordinated the retreat. The dimensional artillery Hell is constructing. How close would I need to be to destroy it? Valen's eyes narrowed. Close enough to die, probably. Why? Because if those weapons become operational, Hell can follow your fleet anywhere in the galaxy. They will have perfected dimensional breach technology, and space becomes meaningless when you can simply open portals to your destination. Your evacuation buys time only if Hell cannot immediately pursue. Understanding dawned in Valen's expression, followed immediately by rejection. You're suggesting a suicide run. One person against whatever Hell has guarding those siege weapons, and it will be their entire remaining military force because they know how valuable those devices are. Yes, that's insane. You'll be killed, or worse, corrupted and turned into another weapon for them to deploy. Perhaps, Thor acknowledged. But I am difficult to kill, harder still to corrupt. And I am not leaving these people without giving them every possible advantage for survival. Those weapons must be destroyed before your fleet jumps. Valen studied him for a long moment, and Thor saw her running calculations, weighing the strategic value of one powerful warrior versus the survival probability of thousands of evacuees. He saw the moment she reached her conclusion and hated herself for it. If you do this, you do it on your own. I cannot spare forces to support you. Every soldier here is needed for the evacuation. I would not ask otherwise. How will you even reach those weapons? They're surrounded by demons, and more are pouring through the breaches every minute. You'll be overwhelmed before you get close. Thor smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I am Thor, son of Odin, and I command the storm itself. Let me show you what that means. He walked to the center of the canyon, away from the defensive positions, away from the soldiers preparing for retreat, to a clear space where he would have room for what came next. Valen followed at a cautious distance, waving back soldiers who moved to intercept. Sensing something significant was about to occur, Thor raised Mjolnir toward the burning sky and called upon powers he had been carefully restraining since his arrival, afraid of what they might reveal to Hell's studying intelligence. But restraint was a luxury he could no longer afford. These people needed a miracle, and he would give them one, even if it cost him everything. The sky answered. Lightning fell from the heavens in a column that connected Earth to the upper atmosphere, so bright it turned night to day, so hot it instantly vaporized moisture from the air, creating a vacuum that collapsed with a thunderclap heard across half the planet. But Thor was not calling natural lightning. He was summoning storm itself, weather-made weapon, the fundamental energies that powered atmospheric phenomena since planets first formed. The Martian atmosphere, thin and weak by Earth standards, suddenly developed a coherent weather system for the first time in millions of years. Clouds boiled into existence, moisture pulled from subsurface ice deposits and superheated until it achieved saturation. Wind rose from nothing to hurricane force in seconds, and at the center of it all, Thor stood channeling power that would have killed lesser beings instantly, his body transformed into a living conduit between heaven and earth. He rose into the air, lifted by wind that obeyed his will absolutely, and pointed toward the distant siege weapons. Lightning answered, but this time it did not merely strike targets. It formed a pathway, a road of electrical discharge that stretched from the canyon to the demon construction site, creating a corridor of ionized air through which Thor launched himself at speeds approaching sound. He crossed 5 miles in 30 seconds, Mjolnir leading the way, and crashed into the demon defensive perimeter like divine judgment made manifest. The first wave of defenders were vaporized before they could react, their bodies unable to withstand the thermal and electrical energies Thor was radiating. He landed amid the siege weapon construction site and began his assault in earnest. Mjolnir swung in great arcs that carved kill zones through massed demon ranks. Every impact generated shockwaves that rippled outward, breaking bones and rupturing organs of creatures too close to the epicenter. Lightning fell continuously now, not random strikes but precisely targeted bolts that sought demonic flesh with predatory eagerness. Thor fought like a god of ancient myth, which is what he was, and for brief moments the demons knew terror. But hell adapted quickly, as it always did. Greater demons began to materialize from the breaches, things that had been held in reserve for precisely this scenario, counters to celestial power that had been developed across eons of warfare against higher beings. They moved with purpose toward Thor, coordinating their assault with disturbing precision. A arch-vial raised its hands and channeled energies that did not merely damage but corrupted, attempting to twist Thor's lightning back against him, to turn his own power into poison in his veins. Thor felt the assault like acid in his blood and responded by channeling even more power through Mjolnir, overwhelming the corruption attempt through sheer output, burning it away before it could take root. A baron of hell, this one massive, even by its species standards, charged with a blade forged from solidified argent energy, a weapon designed to cut through magical defenses. Thor met the charge head-on, Mjolnir intercepting the blade mid-swing, the impact creating a crater and throwing both combatants backward. They collided again and again, trading blows that carved the landscape into new shapes. And still, Thor fought toward the dimensional artillery, destroying everything between himself and his objective with single-minded determination. He was not trying to win this battle. Victory was impossible against these numbers. He was simply trying to buy enough time to reach the siege weapons and destroy them before they became operational. A mancubus planted itself between Thor and the nearest artillery piece, its twin cannons already tracking. It fired point-blank, chemical fire washing over Thor in a wave that should have reduced him to charcoal. Instead, Thor channeled lightning through his body, using it to superheat the flame until it achieved temperatures where chemical bonds broke down, rendering the attack impotent. He closed the distance before the mancubus could recalibrate and brought Mjolnir down on its skull with enough force to create a secondary crater. The siege weapon loomed before him, its twisted geometry finally clear at close range, and Thor saw with horror that it was not merely machinery but alive, a hybrid of architecture and biology that pulsed with its own diseased heartbeat. Argent energy flowed through channels that were simultaneously conduits and veins. The dimensional breach at its core was anchored by structures that might have been bones or might have been support struts, the distinction meaningless. Thor raised Mjolnir for the killing blow and felt reality itself resist. The siege weapon had defense mechanisms woven into its fundamental structure, wards that drew power from the dimensional breach itself. Breaking through them would require more energy than Thor currently possessed after the sustained combat. So he gave it everything, every reserve of power his Asgardian physiology had been hoarding, every drop of divine essence inherited from his father's bloodline, every ounce of determination that had carried him through 1,000 years of battle. He channeled it all through Mjolnir, transforming the hammer into a weapon of true cosmic significance, the kind of power that could crack planets if directed without restraint, and he brought it down. The resulting explosion was not merely physical but dimensional, a rupture that spread through multiple planes of existence simultaneously. The siege weapon did not break so much as cease to exist, its constituent atoms scattered across realities where they could never reform. The dimensional breach at its core collapsed with a sound like the universe screaming, sucking everything nearby into the void before snapping shut. Thor was thrown backward by the blast, his armor cracked, his cape in tatters, blood streaming from nose and ears. But the siege weapon was gone, one down. The demons swarmed him before he could recover, driving him away from the remaining artillery pieces through sheer weight of numbers. He killed as he retreated, every swing of Mjolnir taking multiple lives, but there were always more, an endless tide that crashed against him like ocean waves against stone. His strength was flagging, the sustained power output having drained reserves that would take days to fully replenish. He needed a new strategy. Thor looked at the remaining siege weapons, at the distances between them, and made a terrible calculation. He could not reach them all through sustained combat. But if he were willing to pay the ultimate price, there was another way. He thought of Asgard and silently apologized to his father for what he was about to attempt. Then Thor drove Mjolnir point first into the Martian soil and called upon the Odin force for the second time since arriving in this cursed dimension. The cosmic power flooded through him, but this time he did not try to control it, did not attempt to channel it through careful applications of force. Instead, he let it build, allowed it to accumulate in his body until he became a living bomb of divine energy, a weapon of singular purpose waiting to detonate. The demons sensed the change and tried to retreat, instinct overriding orders as they recognized existential threat. But Thor was faster. He pulled Mjolnir from the ground and spun, building velocity, transforming himself into a projectile aimed at the heart of Hel's construction site. He flew toward the remaining siege weapons with the last of his strength, divine energy building to critical mass, and in the final moment before impact, Thor Odinson thought of home and hoped someone would remember him. Then he struck, and the world ended in light. The explosion could be seen from orbit, a miniature sun blooming on Mars' surface, expanding outward in a perfect sphere that consumed everything within a 5-mile radius. The remaining siege weapons were vaporized instantly. The demon army surrounding them ceased to exist. The dimensional breaches themselves, those wounds in reality through which Hell had been pouring its infinite corruption, flickered and destabilized, their anchoring mechanisms destroyed by energies they had no defense against. And at the center of it all, Thor fell to his knees on ground that had been turned to glass, Mjolnir the only thing keeping him upright, his body pushed beyond every limit, the Odin force having burned through him like fire through paper. He was alive, but just barely, and he could feel the price he had paid. Years, perhaps decades of his lifespan, consumed in exchange for the power to destroy Hell's dimensional artillery. His hands shook, his vision swam. Blood ran from every orifice as his body tried desperately to cope with trauma that should have killed him. But the siege weapons were gone, and with them, Hell's ability to follow the evacuation fleet into deep space. The humans would have their chance to run, to survive, to rebuild somewhere beyond Hell's immediate reach. Thor had kept his promise. He tried to stand and failed, his legs refusing to support his weight. Mjolnir remained steady, the faithful weapon that had served him for so long now serving as a cane to lean against. In the distance, he could see demon reinforcements approaching, curious about what had caused such devastation, preparing to finish him now that he was vulnerable. Let them come. He had bought the time he needed to buy. If this was where his story ended, at least it would end having meant something. But then, thunder rolled across the sky, and Thor looked up through blurred vision to see aircraft descending, human transports flanked by fighter escorts. They swept over the battlefield, weapons hot, engaging the demon reinforcements with coordinated fire that spoke of professional military precision. The lead transport landed 50 yards from Thor's position, and armored soldiers poured out, establishing a defensive perimeter. Commander Valen emerged from the transport, her expression furious and relieved in equal measure. She crossed to where Thor knelt and stood looking down at him with something between exasperation and respect. "You absolute lunatic. We had 12 hours for evacuation, and you just bought us 24 by destroying those weapons. Command has already adjusted the fleet schedule. Every transport that was grounded for lack of protection can now launch safely." She knelt beside him, checking his condition with battlefield medic efficiency. "You look like hell, Prince of Asgard." "No pun intended. Can you walk?" "Not particularly," Thor admitted, his voice roughened by smoke and strain. "But I can be carried, and the name is just Thor. I have earned my way beyond titles today." Valen laughed, short and sharp. "Yes, you have. Come on, let's get you on board before hell sends something we actually can't handle. You've earned your evacuation slot. God knows you've earned it several times over." The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, getting Thor onto a stretcher and loaded into the transport. As they lifted off, Thor caught a final glimpse of the battlefield below, the crater he had created, the broken remnants of Hell's ambition scattered across scorched earth. The breaches were closing now, lacking the dimensional anchors to sustain them, Hell withdrawing to assess its losses and develop new strategies. The war would continue, but not here, not now. Humanity had been given breathing room, and sometimes that was the most anyone could ask for. The transport climbed toward orbit, carrying Thor away from the battlefield, away from Mars, toward whatever future awaited refugees fleeing their own solar system. He closed his eyes and let the medics work, feeling Mjolnir still clasped in his hand, still faithful, still ready for whatever came next. Because there would always be something next. That was the nature of war, the nature of duty, the nature of being someone who stood between darkness and those who could not protect themselves. Thor had thought himself a hero before, fighting for glory in Asgard's eternal wars. But these humans had taught him what heroism truly meant. Not grand gestures and songs, but quiet sacrifice repeated daily. Courage without recognition, duty without reward. He had learned, and he would carry those lessons wherever his path led, whether home to Asgard or forward into humanity's uncertain future. The storm god rested, and above him, the stars of an alien galaxy beckoned toward destinations unknown.